topic of tonight is going to be the question of marriage and what is it. But we're going to begin today with a little bit of recap. We're going to look at some recent history. From about the year 2000 to 2015, there was a national conflict in the United States about the nature of marriage. What is it? Who's it for? Who gets married? Who decides these questions? And the nation was kind of split roughly equally on the nature of marriage. The two sides, if you kind of stack them up against one another, you have on the one side you have corporations, the entertainment industry, the news media, the academia, the legal establishment, and various LGBT advocacy groups all together on one side. On the other side you have conservative Christians, the end. And those conservative Christians had already kind of compromised themselves on a number of different issues, such as accepting the possibility of divorce and contraception. And there was also this huge vein of anti-intellectualism within Christian circles where they basically they replaced their brain with a Bible and then refused to use the brain that they had just removed and refused to engage in the intellectual life and think of ways to defend their positions other than just citing Bible verses. Together, the weaknesses of the Christians and the strengths of the secular movement ultimately led to the Supreme Court deciding in 2015 that the definition of marriage previously enjoyed by America and human history was out of date, and Justice Kennedy effectively redefined marriage nationally to remove any reference to biological sex. In short, we lost. So today, at least from my perspective, this issue is a dead letter when it comes to politics. There's just no national movement to try to undo the Obergefell decision in the way that there is a movement to try to undo the Roe versus Wade decision. So as far as I'm concerned, the political aspect of this thing is dead. And so we're not going to be talking about that tonight. But it's still alive in the cultural and interpersonal sphere. It's still something that you'll get asked about. It's still something that we're called upon to answer for. And so tonight's approach is going to have nothing to do with politics or cultural movements or political parties or anything like that. Tonight's approach is going to be a simple scenario of how do you respond when called to account for the church's teaching, and how are you to answer a person who is skeptical or even hostile to it. So that's what we're doing tonight. So let's start with the argument. A person approaches you and says, why is the Catholic Church still clinging to this ancient bigotry and not allowing LGBT people to get married? It's current year. If you've ever seen that meme, a person appeals to, it's current year and we're still doing this. And it's like, what's so special about this year? But anyways, but you hear people say that a lot in this setting. Is they'll say, it's current year, why have Catholics not gotten with the program, why are you guys still clinging to that ancient bigotry of denying the right of LGBT people to get married? So what do you say when approached by this person? Well, the first thing I would advise you to do is to turn the question back around. So I would reply to the person by saying, we have to define our terms first. All right, I'm not going to just sit here and be on the defensive. I want to ask you a question, reply. What do you mean when you say the word marriage? What's that word to you? Why do you think it's so important? Can you explain to me your thoughts on this before we move forward? All right? Because the modern attempts to define marriage aren't all that robust. A person might say, marriage is when two people make their love public and permanent, and involves a sharing of property and responsibilities. Or if you take the definition that's actually in the Obergefell Supreme Court decision, Justice Kennedy said it's an enduring monogamous bond for intimacy, mutual support, personal growth, and public recognition. But there's some questions you can ask about that definition and its cogency. So for instance, what's so important about it being monogamous? Why not 4 people if they choose? There's nothing in the logic of saying, well, this is about the public recognition of people who love each other that demands it be 2. Why can't it be 4 people who love each other if they're all on the same page and they're all accepting of this circumstance? What's so important about the number 2? It's just kind of standing out there with no reason. And why does it have to be a romance? What's so important about romance? Why is it that suddenly we want to have a government registry of people who are having sex? Like, what? Whose bright idea is that? Why is that important that Uncle Sam knows that? Why is that different from any other activity? Why don't I have to register with the state when I have a tennis team, for instance? Why is it that romance is the thing that calls for us to go to the government and have a marriage? And then, why does it have to be an enduring bond? Why can't it just be until the 2 of you get sick of each other? You know, marriage is hard. Why not just say, well, this is going to be a bond for as long as you can make it work. There's going to be no expectation of permanency, and there's going to be no sort of sense of tragedy when it ends in divorce. What's the purpose of these defining characteristics that they give to marriage, and yet it doesn't seem that there's a reason for any of them to be there? It's not that the definition is incoherent, it's that it doesn't have a reason for itself. My favorite analogy is it's sort of like Wile E. Coyote after having run off the cliff. He stays, if you guys have seen old Bugs Bunny cartoons, he stays in the air for a period of time until he looks down, at which point he falls. But there's that brief period where he's standing on absolutely nothing. And I feel like the definition of marriage that is enjoyed by their secular culture is sort of like that. It has all these features, it's kind of up in the air, but it doesn't have any sort of core reason that explains why it is what it is. To use another bad analogy, it's like someone took the hands off of a watch, keeping all the gears underneath. All these features, but the core purpose has been lost. It seems like something is missing. And so, at this point, I respond to the person saying, the reason why we don't have same-sex couples getting married in the Catholic Church is because we have a different concept of the nature of marriage, one which preserves the core purpose of the thing. And so what you've done here is you've driven the conversation away from why are you guys so bigoted to, well, what the hell is marriage anyways? Let's talk about the nature of marriage. That's a more fruitful conversation to have. So, what is our concept of marriage and how do we arrive at it? And here I like to appeal, if we could, to an outside perspective. What if we just considered the perspective of aliens as aliens look at human beings? You know, they're not in our culture, they don't have any dog in this race, they're just studying us like pets. So, an alien would observe that humans are born at a male-female ratio of about 1 to 1, right? And they have, and so it seems like there might be some sort of need for the 2 of them to pair off with that sort of ratio. And he would also observe that any individual human only has half of a reproductive system, and the females have the other half. And so it seems like there's sort of an intentional relatedness between male and female, that they're, from a hardware perspective, meant to go together, that the intentionality of our bodies points to one another at a 1-to-1 ratio. Now, why is that? Asks our intrepid alien. Well, when those 2 sexes do relate, there is, of course, an emotional exchange of affection, there's an endorphin rush, which everyone loves, and then there's a strong emotional bond that forms between the 2 of them. All right? But there's something else that happens, and it's babies. So most importantly to the survival of the species is that when the 2 halves of our species get together, you have the potential for the creation of a new, helpless human. Now let's look at things from the perspective of the new helpless human. So that child is born with really only one thing in the world, his rights, her rights. He or she has the right to the parents. This is something that became very clear to me when my first son was born. As I was holding him, I realized that he had nothing in the world, but he did have the right to me. You know, whatever other rights our society might recognize, I knew that just from nature, from the nature of him being my son, he had the right to me. So the child has the right to both parents. and the parents have corresponding duties to the child. Likewise, the parents have the natural right to the child. They have the right to raise this child, which is theirs. And the child has the duties to obey the parents and to be raised by those parents. And then also, what's many times forgotten, is that the parents have the right to each other's cooperation in this endeavor of raising the kid, and the child has the right to the parents' cooperation. You might say to yourself, well, you can imagine the saying that the child has the right to the parents, but they live in different houses. You know, sort of a divorce situation where, yeah, the child gets to be raised by the father, the child gets to be raised by the mother, but no, the child actually has the right to the father and the mother cooperating together. So that leads us to the observation that it's important in society that everyone recognizes and respects these rights. So if you imagine what would happen if parents just didn't care that they had kids that they had duties to, or if you had kids who didn't care they have parents they have duties to, or parents don't recognize they have the obligation to cooperate in raising the kids. So the society falls apart because we depend on families to raise up the next generation. So it's super important, not just on a personal level, but also on a public level, that everyone respect the duties and obligations that happen when male and female get together and they make new humans. And so if it's so important, it would make sense to sort of solemnize it with like big public oaths that everyone takes and they get super dressed up for, and they have to be uncomfortable and starving for the whole day. And then when you get to the reception, you don't get to eat your own freaking cake because you're shaking hands with everyone and you're so busy. You have to eat your cake when you get home from your honeymoon, and it costs a lot of money. And the guest list is like the worst part. It's the worst part. The guest list is the worst part. Oh God, how you will hate the guest list part. Anyway, so it's really important that you make some sort of public affirmation that you guys are going to be in this together, to form a union in preparation for the inevitable kids that result from the sexual cooperation of the two of you. Now, people oftentimes say that kids grow up so fast. That is false. That's objectively false. Kids don't grow up so fast. They take forever to grow up. Absolutely forever, right? I mean, when people tell me that my kids, they're like, oh, enjoy it now. They grow up so fast, and like you're changing diapers with poop so huge that you could start a new continent with the amount of poop that they produce. And you're thinking to yourself, I wish I could have a law that every time a person says, oh, they grow up so fast, enjoy this time, I want to punish them with a week of changing the diapers, just so they can remember that, no, they don't grow up so fast. It takes 3 years for them just to learn how to poop in a can, right? So the kids don't grow up so fast. So the partnership that the parents have to be involved in has to be one that gets you that far, that actually successfully raises the kid. It has to be an enduring union that they agree to. And not just that, because once you're done raising your kid, your kid, give it a few years, is going to produce the grandkids, and now you're needed once more for them too. So really, you're kind of in this for life. And so therefore, it makes sense for these promises to be for life. And so just by considering the nature of male and female from an outside perspective, just the objective facts of biology and a little bit of ethics, we arrive at the need for a union which is between a man and a woman, which is monogamous, prepared for the creation of new life, and lifelong. All right? Just from reason alone and just observing basic facts about the world. This is affirmed in the Catechism of the Catholic Church in section 1601, which says, marriage is a lifelong covenant between a man and a woman and is by its nature ordered towards the good of the spouses and the procreation and education of offspring. This is also confirmed by an ancient construction worker who said, have you not read that the one who made them from the beginning made them male and female, and for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh, so that they are no longer two but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no man separate. So that's our perspective on the nature of marriage from reason and the church and from Revelation. And so going back to our conversation, after explaining some of that maybe in fewer words I would say, so the reason why we don't have same-sex marriage, so to speak, in the Catholic Church is because that's not what that word means. It would be like saying that we want to have four-wheeled tricycles or six-sided squares. Once you understand the meaning of the word square or tricycle, you realize you can't have those things. So folks can call it whatever they want, but this union that they form, it's not a marriage, either by natural philosophy or divine revelation. And that's the explanation as to why we cling to these ancient bigotries and so on, is because it's just a grasp of what the nature of male and female is and the importance of the union of the two together and their duties to their children and to one another. Let's go with the objections now. What are the objections that you'll face when going over this? So probably the first objection a person will think of is called the infertile couples objection. So a person will say, if marriage is dependent on creating kids, then why does the church allow infertile couples to get married? So this is probably the hardest objection because the answer is the most abstract. And I suppose as a side note, one thing to point out is that for most people, you don't find out you're an infertile couple until like you're married, and then say, okay, now you're married and now you decide it's time to start having kids, and now you're about 8 months into that and it's not working, and now you find out you're an infertile couple. There's no fertility test that you can take beforehand that would possibly allow for the church to discern, even if the church had any interest in discerning whether a couple was fertile before it got married. So it's kind of, from a practical level, an impossible demand on the church to even consider this. But there's better reasons than that. But again, they're abstract. So we're going to do a thought experiment to get at the reason why. So let's imagine two Earths. In Rick and Morty, there's infinite number of realities, and so let's just imagine these. And I saw a couple smiles from people who know what Rick and Morty is, so thank you for that. Let's imagine world A, in which every couple is a same-sex couple. And these couples, they never cheat on each other, and everything just stays inside the couple. They don't receive any help in their sexual lives from anybody else. Again, just the two couples together, but they're all same-sex couples on this planet. On the planet B, you have nothing but opposite-sex couples, and again, these couples never cheat. They never get help from the outside in conceiving kids. They're just going to rely on their resources as opposite-sex couples. Now, fast forward 120 years. What's the status of these two worlds? What does it look like? On planet A, humanity went extinct. On planet B, humanity is doing fine. Right? So why is that? Well, it's because these two unions are of a different nature. They're different sorts of things. An opposite-sex couple is procreative by its nature. Not in every instance, because of course you can have disease or age or something like that which can render a person infertile, but the opposite sex union is by its nature a procreative union, even if certain couples experience infertility. So it's sort of like how four-leggedness belongs to the nature of a dog, and yet there are dogs that have 3 legs, even 2 legs. And to make another bad analogy, even though these marriages that are infertile can't fulfill the core purpose of marriage, they're still marriages by nature. All right, so the comparison here is, a car with a bad engine, it can't move, but it's still a car. You still look at it and you're like, that's a car. The nature of that thing is that of a car, even if it's broken down. All right, so what I say to the person is, I never said a marriage has to successfully create a kid in order to be a marriage. It's the union which is oriented towards kids because it joins together male and female. It's in preparation for any potential kids that might come from this union. And since some marriages may not succeed in bearing children because of infertility, but they're still marriages in the same way that a car with a bad engine is still a car. So it'd be silly to say that we can call a car with a bad engine, or rather, it would be silly to say we still call that car with a bad engine a car, therefore we can call this brick a car. Right? The brick is immobile by its nature, and the car is immobile because it's got something wrong. I hope that makes sense. That leads us to our second objection. bad biblical examples. So a person says, you base your definition off the Bible, but don't you know that the Bible has many different definitions of marriage in it? Just ask King Solomon. This is of a person who went to like Sunday school just long enough to learn all the nasty bits in the Old Testament and then, and then checked out. So the first thing I would note is, first, we're not exclusively pulling this from the Bible. I just explained all this from natural law and reasoning. Were you even listening to me at all? And this happens though. Things that are this explicitly the person wasn't listening happens. Especially if you listen to Catholic Answers long enough, especially their pro-life nights. So Trent Horn will go through the entire pro-life argument from nothing but just basic reason, basic ethics, and biology. Just spell the whole thing out, and the person will, as if not a single word was heard, just say, well, that's just your religious opinion and stuff. And it's were you, the entire, I want those 7.5 minutes of my life back, right? But again, so you'll get that. Even if you just explain the whole thing from biology and reason, you'll still get a person who says, well, that's just your biblical opinion. And it's no, I just wasted all my time. But it is true that the Old Testament does have some elements about marriage that we don't accept today. For instance, Deuteronomy chapter 24 has laws concerning how to properly divorce. There's no limit to the amount of polygamy you can find in the Old Testament, but of course, if you go to the book of Kings, you can find David and Solomon famously having numerous wives. And then probably the most jarring of them all is in Deuteronomy chapter 21. It instructs the Hebrews on how to properly take captive war brides. As in, you conquered a region, and now you want to marry some of the attractive women there whose husbands you just killed. How do you properly do that? And there's codes on that. And so people will look at that and say, well, you think you take your definition of the marriage from the Bible, but have you seen the Old Testament? However, Jesus himself, as in God incarnate himself, said that God made accommodations in the area of marriage. So if you know enough of the New Testament to be dangerous, you would know that Jesus said that because of the hardness of your hearts, Moses allowed you to divorce. But from the beginning, it was not so. And so as we look back at some of these Old Testament practices that we wouldn't approve of today, we can recognize that that wasn't the full intention that God wanted for marriage. This was an accommodation to their weaknesses. At Acts, sometimes I'll give the example of the captive war brides. And it sounds jarring when you read it. You're like, this is horrible. How could God sanction such a thing? But then the question you have to ask is, without this law regulating it, what worse things might happen to a conquered people, conquered women in that time period? Use your imaginations. And then then the people start using their imaginations, and they start getting these looks on their faces, and you're like, okay, now stop using your imaginations. That's enough of that. But the point is that just because you see something in the Bible does not mean that that's what God wanted, full stop. What Jesus says is what we read before, is he gives us the final word. So I would say to the person, the final word when it comes to divine revelation are the words of Jesus Christ. Period. For Christians, it's Jesus. He's the guy. So he affirmed that marriage is a lifelong partnership between man and woman. That's what we're going with. And he said everything else was an accommodation. So that's the end of that objection. All right, the next objection is, this is just like racism. So a person will say, it wasn't long ago that people banned interracial marriage, and this is eerily similar to that, ... So, literally the only similarity between what we're talking about and banning interracial marriage is that two humans are being told that they can't get married. But you have to ask what we mean when we say no, and the reasons why we say no are utterly different from banning interracial marriage. So in order to help the person see that, I'll throw the question back at him. And I'll say, do you think that any time two people are told that they can't be married, it is just like banning interracial marriage? Even if they're siblings or something, as in brother and sister, you're telling brother and sister they can't get married, is that like banning interracial marriage? And the person will say, well, no, but that's totally different. There's actually a good reason for that. Exactly. There's a different reason. Now, what are the reasons involved here? In banning interracial marriage, or interethnic marriage, as I prefer to say, because like there's one human race and there's ethnicities within the race, whatever, that's all terminology. So anyways, when racists were banning interracial marriage, they acknowledged that these were going to be real marriages. They weren't contesting that what was being formed was a marriage. They were saying that they didn't like those marriages because they had false notions about blood purity and ethnic superiority, and so they said, they gave away the fact that they said, yeah, that would be a marriage, but we just don't want that marriage to happen. Whereas when we're talking about how in the Catholic Church we don't have same-sex marriage, we're basically saying that based on the natural biological facts of sexual complementarity and parentage, the definition of marriage just is the union of a potential mother and father, and therefore it can't be between two people of the same sex. It's like the difference between saying, no blue pentagons allowed, like that blue pentagon offends me, get rid of it, right? And then just saying, that's not a pentagon. That's what's really going on when we're saying that, that same-sex marriage is not a thing, like either by reason or revelation. That's the difference, is that in banning interracial marriages, they said, no blue pentagons allowed, I hate blue pentagons, punish anyone who makes a blue pentagon. And what we're doing is we're looking at people who are trying to draw a four-sided object and saying, you have not drawn a pentagon. So, on the same note, I would say that Catholics aren't responsible for the nonsense which is done by other Christians. The Catholic Church has always held that there is one race. We are all sons and daughters of Adam and Eve. There is one race, humanity. And humans, male and female, can marry each other regardless of their ethnicity. And so as Catholics, we've never actually had a problem with interethnic marriage, like never. In fact, in the American South, there was a Catholic priest who was martyred for officiating an interracial marriage. So that's what we'll say about that objection. Now we'll get to sort of the last one, which is the what harm is it to you objection. So a person says, okay, but why not just afford the same dignity to same-sex couples anyways? What does it take away from you? A person might say, what does it do to your marriage if other people get to be called by the same word, or if the priest blesses other people? What does that do to your marriage? Right? And if the question is only what it does to me and my marriage, then the answer is not much. But there's a bigger picture. Marriage as an institution is tied to forming families and raising kids. And if you change your understanding of marriage, you are necessarily changing your understanding of parenting and family and all the duties that we talked about before. You can't change one without the other. So people will sometimes say that a child raised by two men or two women such a child is no worse off. But what does that mean? What is the corollary to that statement? What else is implied by that? Well, if you look at an individual instance, if you're being raised by two women, you have no dad. If you're being raised by two men, you have no mom. So if you say a boy lacks nothing when being raised by two women, what you're saying is a father brings no unique value into a boy's life. Like, you can't have the left side of that chart without the right side. If you say a girl lacks nothing when being raised by two men, what you're saying is a mother brings no unique value into a girl's life. Like, those two are equivalent statements. And so when a person asks me, what's the harm? My response is, well, if we redefine the institution to include same-sex marriage, we'd end up with a concept of marriage which denies the irreplaceable value of moms and dads. You wind up there. I mean, aside from the whole question of, disobeying the word of God and all that stuff, in the end, you can't affirm, if you're going to affirm that all these situations are equal, then you're also affirming that moms and dads aren't unique, that their roles are all irreplaceable, and that they offer nothing of, individual or irreplaceable value to anyone's life. Sometimes you'll meet a person who will bite that bullet. So you'll say to a person, do you think that a mom doesn't add anything unique or irreplaceable of value to a girl or boy's life, or same thing for a dad? Do you really think that there's nothing that a mom brings that's just unique to being a mom? Sometimes people will bite that bullet. They'll just say, no, nothing unique is brought by having a mother. And usually, I hate to say it, but people who are willing to go there are people who have suffered in their home, to put it mildly. A person is really only willing to say dads bring nothing to the situation unless they're not first angry at their dad. So, I mean, if a person agrees with that, then I feel very sorry for the person first and foremost. Sometimes, though, a person will try to affirm that on the basis of, they'll say, well, studies prove, but when you dig into the studies and the sample sizes and stuff like that and how their bases of comparison are, pretty much all of them are hogwash. And people, I mentioned this last time, people throw studies at each other on the internet as if they're all experts for hours. And for me, I just like to go back to common sense. Do you really think that a girl doesn't benefit in any unique way by having a mother? Really? I mean, no study is going to disprove that to me. So, let's close with some advice here. First of all, when you're in these conversations, and this is general advice for pretty much all situations, whether it's, conversations about marriage or coronavirus, stay calm, don't panic. All right? Nothing good happens when you lose your cool. Nothing. Going back to what I said at the beginning, don't let it be only you that's on trial. If you're just trying to defend yourself, then the person that you're dealing with walks away feeling like, I won, I stood up for justice. But if you can give it back to the person and show the other person, you have a definition of marriage too. You have some questions to answer too. Again, why only two people? Why are you denying the rights of people who are in thruples or quadruples to get married? You have some tough questions too. And I have a basis for my understanding of marriage. What's yours? So don't let it only be you on trial. Next, keep away from the political questions. Again, I think the political question is dead. So if a person asks, well, how would we possibly implement your view of marriage in the public sphere? I just sort of steer clear of those questions. We're talking about the Catholic faith. That's what you asked me about. Why do Catholics do X, Y, Z? I'm answering for Catholics. All right, I'm not here to put on a public policy seminar. So Republicans, Democrats, inheritance laws, taxations, none of these are part of the question. We're talking about the Catholic understanding of marriage. And so, on that note, focus on the nature of marriage. That's where the conversation needs to go to. If all pro-life conversations go to what is the nature of the being inside the woman's womb, all conversations about marriage go to what is the nature of marriage, what's it for, why is it important to have a lifelong union between man and woman, which honors the rights and duties of the children they create. Why is it important that we just don't say it's a romantic union between consenting adults? The nature of marriage is worth defending. I remember when back 2013, 2010, those years, I remember that no one, on Facebook, because people used Facebook back then, they still do today, but my feed was clogged up with people talking about how wrong and terrible it is to believe in the natural, classical, biological understanding of marriage. And there wasn't a single dissenting voice. And I remember saying to my wife at the time, I was like, I feel like I have to say something, but if I do, I will never be respectable again. I will lose friends, and I will be called things, and I will never recover from that socially if I start making a defense for the church's understanding of marriage. And she encouraged me to do that anyway. She was like, well, what good is respectability anyway? And so it's worth not being respectable for. It's worth getting called things for. The nature of marriage is central to our Christian faith. It's worth fighting for. It's worth being hated for. The Christian understanding of marriage, it's built into our nature as humans, and it's also an intrinsic part of how God wants to relate to us. It's part of the gospel. And so it's worth your time, it's worth your energy, it's worth sacrificing for, because it's the word of the Lord that therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This is mystery is profound, but I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. So that's what we have for tonight. Thank you, guys.